Okay, this is class number 5 on Golden Doves. We're in the introduction on page Roman numeral 12, 3 lines from the top. Essential to this outlook, we were discussing the Wissenschaft des Judentum, the scientific study of Judaism, and now we are going to be continuing along the same lines. So go ahead. Essential to this outlook.
Okay. Essential to this outlook is the belief that Jewish history reflects a gradual progress, to be understood in Hegelian terms, of the national or religious spirit peculiar to Judaism.
Right, because in Hegel, one thing that Hegel did when he studied the various histories of different nations in the world, and he had a survey of different nations, is he always tried to break down their history in terms of thesis. Thesis meant there was a certain status quo that was around for a while. And during that status quo that the nation didn't really realize its spirit. The spirit of the nation wasn't awake. And then there was a crisis. There was an antithesis. And this crisis led to an awakening. So in the case of Germany, we can say that the great economic catastrophe that followed World War I plus the economic catastrophe was the great crisis. And this led to the awakening of the German spirit. And finally, the third stage is synthesis. Synthesis is when now the spirit of the nation realizes its freedom. So it's 2 stages. First, it has to be aware that it desires freedom, and then it actually realizes the freedom. So they broke down the history of the various countries, Hegel, in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? So they tried this also with Am Yisrael.
So along the lines of what you were saying last class about Rav Kook's methodology, many people draw a parallel between this and what Rav Kook says about the thesis being the Ummah having some sort of vision of whatever needs to be. Antithesis is the Chilonut, the secularism that entered Am Yisrael, Hilul Shabbat, etc., that whole thing. And the synthesis is where Am Yisrael is today or now, or where we're on the way to. Right. That's where they draw the parallel between the.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I'm not sufficiently, admittedly, I'm not sufficiently sufficient with the writings about Rav Kook, who, by the way, we both, this is the video, because I know other people could be watching this, we both respect immensely and we both recognize his great contribution to Am Yisrael, but we respectfully, acknowledge the relationship between Hegelian thinking and his own ideas on the modern state of Israel and Jewish history. So we're just noting it. So we can respect and love somebody immensely and still note that he may have certain Hegelian attitudes.
Right. Okay. It was also maintained that scholars could be totally free from all value judgments and personal convictions and discover the objective truth, much as scientists observe pure empirical facts. I'll be in charge of looking at the notes and saying if there's...
Yes. So the same way I can empirically measure the room temperature, the air temperature in this room, that's an empirical fact. And I can go to another room and measure the air temperature in that room. That's an empirical fact. Similarly, I can measure different nations and different cultures based upon fixed rulers, and I will use the same ruler to measure every one of these nations, right? That's the scientific study of nations, the scientific study of the humanities, and the scientific study of Judaism.
Yes. Actually, this notion of Jewish scholarship entailed much more than the mere description of facts.
Right.
Sero Baron has already noticed how the theocratic view of history dominating... Putting on the recording?
Yeah, okay. So just reading some of Hegel's ideas about history, because this will help us understand what is meant by the theocratic view of history. So, for example, first of all, for Hegel, the state is the consummation of ethics, right? So I'm going to actually read what Hegel says. I'm reading it now. The state is absolutely rational in as much as it is the actuality of the substantial will, which it possesses in the particular self-consciousness, once that consciousness has been raised to consciousness of its universality. So basically what it's saying is that the state has a spirit, and this spirit has to achieve a certain self-consciousness. And once it achieves its, it awakens up and it achieves its self-consciousness, at that point, it reaches the great, ethical level that it should reach. And by definition, it is an ethical and rational spirit. And I want to read to you a few other things about what Hegel says, because the point of theocracy is as follows. The point of theocracy is Paro is the king of Mitzrayim. The reason Paro is the king of Mitzrayim is because Paro communicates with the gods. He has access to the divine spirit. And because he has access to the divine spirit, Paro has a right to be, he is a divinity, and therefore he has a right to lead Egypt. If Egypt were to fail, that would show that Paro is no longer in contact with the gods, and therefore he's no longer a legitimate king. Similarly, Nebuchadnezzar was a divinity, right? And that's why he makes an image of himself, and he puts the gold obelisk with his face on the top, and everybody has to bow down, because Nebuchadnezzar is in contact with the gods, and because he's in contact with the gods, he has a right to lead Babel. So the theocratic view of history is that there is a relationship between the state and religion, and that relationship is the state, the political leadership, or in the case of a dictatorship, the dictator, is in touch with the emet of the gods, and that's what makes him legitimate. And Hegel,
by the way, that's
go ahead.
That's merging of church and state.
Yes, absolutely.
Which
it absolutely is.
Exactly what in the shadow of in this book, he has a whole. I mean, I'm not going to read it right now, but he has a whole big section speaking about how there was a totalitarian mindset that came as a result of this merging of God with the state, with the political establishment.
Yes.
That was exactly what Am Yisrael, wasn't about.
Yes. Now I'm just going to read you one more sentence of Hegel, because this will kind of this will explain the theocratic view of history, or the relationship between Hegelian historiography and theocracy. And we're going to read one more thing. The state is the actuality of concrete freedom. Meaning, once the spirit of the state awakens and it becomes self-conscious, then it becomes the actuality of actual freedom, because there is freedom and potential, and then there's the actual freedom that the state gives once it reaches, for example, the Third Reich in Germany, because that was the great freedom of the German people that they reached. Obviously, I say that, what is the expression, tongue-in-cheek, because for them,
yeah, of course,
they were a bunch of barbarians, but that's not the point. We're looking at historiography, the way they viewed themselves, and not the emet. But here, continuing with Hegel, but concrete freedom consists in this. Listen to what freedom is for the Goy mind, and for Hegel, and for Germans, and you will understand it all. What is the great freedom? That personal individuality and its particular interests not only achieve their complete development and gain explicit recognition for their right, but what is freedom? Freedom means, well, every individual should be free, right? Every individual should gain his rights. But what is that? How does an individual gain his rights? How do you attain freedom as an individual? And here's the punchline. They pass over of their own accord into the interest of the universal. You have to squash your individuality, become part of the collective state, right? Crowds and power, Elias Canetti, we're all part of one collective and my ideas are not important, right? I have to be brainwashed by the state and consumed by the state. And that's when you realize your freedom. They even recognize as their own substantive mind, right? The idea of the state, it takes over the mind. Brother, I saw again, and I'm saying this, the mechilat kavod, I'm saying this not chas v'shalom to be critical, but I want Am Yisrael to free itself from Gentile thinking. So please, don't take this as a critical way. But I did see this among many, unfortunately, dati le'umi, who we love, but the influence of Arav Kook is the Ummah has to consume you. And I've actually heard these very words in the context of you have to become part of the Ummah and the rest doesn't matter at that point. Once you're part of the Ummah, your individuality is less important. I don't know if you've heard that, but I've actually heard this from people expressing his ideas with love.
I know the sources. I know the sources. The sources say very simply that in order to be I'm going to say it like in the right way. In order to be the properly part of Am Yisrael, one must get rid of any individual aspect of his reality.
Right. Exactly. That's right. And
which is, by the way, going to this week's parasha in America and last week's in Israel. I mentioned this last time we studied also. When everybody's holy, and you want to be if everybody's holy, nobody's holy. If you don't recognize that everybody has an individual aspect to them. That's what Korach was doing. That's the totalitarian thing. Sami Ben Uliel, that he mentioned to me, very, very nicely. I'm saying it davar b'shem umro, that Yimach Shemo b'shem zichro, Hitler used to wear the clothing, the uniform of the working class to show that he is like everybody, in order to show that he's part of the everybody, part of the Ummah.
He is by being by the Ummah.
And by the way, and that's George Orwell's thing in Animal Farm, which I also heard, by the way, from Sami Ben Uliel. George Orwell says all animals are created equal, but some animals are created more equal than others. It's the same. That's the idea. That's what Korach was saying. Korach was saying, and please let me be the leader, as a midrash would add upon to Korach what Korach's insinuation was there.
Right. So let me summarize what we said in Toma, because we really said a lot, and it's really hard. Hegel is incredibly subtle, incredibly complex, and it's even to the point where it's difficult to make statements that Hegel said this, because his statements are so subtle and at times they appear contradictory that it's zelo davar she'efshar stam ledaber al zeh. But this is his words, and we can rely on his words. So let's just summarize it. The theocratic view of history is the connection between the political leaders and religion and God and divinity, right? And when you buy into that connection, that the king is God, then you can bow down before a Nimrod. You can bow down before a Paro, before Nebuchadnezzar, right? And you give up your individuality, right? Mm-hmm. Because the spirit of the nation has awakened, and that spirit is, by definition, the ultimate ethics and the ultimate right. And as an individual, you obtain your rights by subsuming yourself to that spirit, to the nation, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the idea, Mechila, of the Ummah, which the Mechilat Kavod, we completely oppose. Judaism is based on the exact opposite, about individuality, about people realizing themselves and understanding the Emet from the Selim Elohim that God gave them. But that's a subject for a different class, so we're not going to talk about that now. We're just trying to understand now the Choshech. We're not trying to understand the Or. We're trying to understand the darkness, not the light. So this is the darkness. We're delving into the darkness now. So let's continue in the actual text.
One moment. Yes.
1 second.
Paused it?
Yeah, just 1 second, please. Yeah, okay.
Before you play it, 1 moment. I'm looking for a quote. Before you play it.
Oh, yeah, okay, I'll pause.
There's a quote. Okay.
Right, go ahead. What page
so
are
actually,
you? Where are you reading from?
So I'm reading now, I'm going to read from The Shadow of History in page 169. It's a chapter where he discusses, a little bit of actually Spinoza, but it really touches upon this point very nicely, sovereignty and the totalitarian state.
Yep.
It takes really this idea like one step further, gives like the consequences of. The most important element in Spinoza's political thinking is the belief that sovereignty and right are the effect of power.
Yep.
He who has power has sovereignty, and vice versa. God has absolute sovereignty because God has absolute power. Power has a cosmological value. The consequence of such thinking is that by nature, all do not have the same rights. Each individual's right is determined by his limited power. I could continue, but the idea is understandable.
It's clear. That shows right, and that shows that also the secularists have adopted this religion for the secular people. And now you understand, secular people are deeply religious. They're deeply religious. Just for them, the God is Paro. For them, the God is Nebuchadnezzar. For them, the God is, the head of the Communist Party, whoever it happens to be, right? So they are deeply religious. And I know why there is such a powerful and motivating force for people when it comes to politics, especially now, more so than in the past, because people have become less religious. And by less religious, I mean less of, unfortunately, Mehila, but many Jews now, they're kind of not what they used to be. And we see this in American society, religion has gone down the drain. That's why political religion has gone up, because if you don't have the values and the Torah and the mitzvot, then, well, you have Nimrod and you have Paro and you have the Communist Party. And that's what's making an ascendancy today in America, meaning all these fanatic ideas, all these fanatic ideologies, that's where it comes from. So yeah, let's go back to that. I think we understand this point. Let's finish the paragraph, and I think with that we will also finish this class. So please, go ahead.
Okay. Salo Baron has already noticed how the theocratic view of history dominating ancient and medieval authors was also present among modern historians.
Right. So what he's saying is that when the authors of history, the old historians, right, from the medieval period and from the ancient times, they had a theocratic view of history. They believed in, the divinity of the kings and the divinity, the relationship between gods and these kings. That's the way they portrayed history. That was their historiography, right? So we see Hegel has a similar historiography. He also has a very religious view of history. Yes.
With all variations from Kruchmalt and Zuntz to Geiger, Greats, and Goodman, the underlying concept, these guys, I guess, are all German historians,
yes,
German modern historians.
After
the
Hegel.
The underlying concept nurtured from the overpowering forces of Hegelianism in the German philosophy in general was in more than one respect, but a continuation of the old doctrine.
Yes, the old doctrine was Nebuchadnezzar has powers. He is connected with the gods. The gods tell Nebuchadnezzar what to do. Ditto for all other despots. They are religious figures. That's why in pagan religions, the Kohen Gadol was also the king, right? They were the ones who brought the korbanot, right? Whereas in Judaism, we separate that for obvious reasons. So this that we say, oh, Hegel is, he's a genius. He is actually a brand new revolutionary ideas about history. Salo Baron says, no, it's actually a continuation of the old doctrine. He also has a very religious view of history, right? It just, the forms, the forms are a little different, right?
That's why I'm happy I read that quote, because that quote shows how the secularists adopted this idea, and among the secularists were these German historians. They were secular, in their ideology, and because it was the guy to start with that, and right. From the secular perspective of things.
And by the way, Marxism is an extension of Hegel, because Marx has a very deeply religious view of the government, and for them, utopia, Gan Eden, will only be achieved by the communist government. That's a religious view. And that's why these secular Jews, let's say many secular Jews in Israel, and in Israel, or secular Goyim, it doesn't matter where, when they're communists, they're actually fervently religious, right? And that's such an important point for us to understand. They are religious, they are dogmatic, and they are fanatic. That's what happened to the Germans. I mean, they were fanatic barbarians, but God help us if they take over, these fanatics take over America, because we see what they do in the name of religion. God help us. I think that's a good place to finish this shiur.
ברוך אדוני לעולם, אמן ואמן.
Okay, so let me